So the good news is God is generous and equitable and inclusive of all people when it comes to grace and work and love. We're not to judge God's reasons for seeming to bless someone else more than we've been blessed. We're not to judge ourselves as more deserving because we worked harder or we knew more. Or we could check off all the boxes of being the best disciple. No. In God's justice, God's mercy, thankfully, even for those of us who can barely check off one box of doing what God has required of us, even we are given God's great gifts of grace and life and eternal love. The ancient city of Nineveh, that first story that Fern read for us, was a very large and wicked city in Assyria. And God told Jonah to go there and to warn the people to turn back to God and away from the bad things that they were doing. But Jonah didn't want to. The Assyrians were hated enemies of Israel. They had burned the homes of God's people and forced many people to become refugees. They were a different faith tradition and culture. And Jonah didn't want to help his enemies. So, as you know this story, God actually had to carry him over there in a whale, as the story goes, because Jonah tried to get out of this assignment. But when the whale finally released him on Nineveh's shore, Jonah did give them God's warning. And amazingly, all the people in this very big city actually asked God to forgive them. And God did. And then Jonah was mad at God for being so gracious and merciful and slow to anger, preferring not to punish, abounding in steadfast love even to enemies. So God helped Jonah learn that loving our neighbors, not condemning those we view as enemies, being merciful, speaking truth and justice, is God's way, and to be ours also. Last Sunday afternoon, I attended an excellent panel discussion at Concordia College on the 4 Abrahamic views of Jesus. There were Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, and Christian panelists, and they were all friends, yet they believed deeply in God in their own traditions. The Jewish speaker spoke honestly about his discomfort with Jesus because of the anti-Semitism and the brutal history of Christian hatred. But he said it really mattered that the Catholic and the Lutheran churches had both repudiated that history. And he talked about God's teachings of loving kindness and charity and forgiveness. The Muslim speaker said that there are more stories in the Quran about Jesus than anyone else except the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and that Jesus is a very revered prophet in Islam. And the people of the Baha'i faith also revere Jesus as a sacred being, a messenger, who among other messengers educates and uplifts human beings to advance their faith. He said universal love is the tenet of all religions. The Christian speaker talked about Jesus as an interfaith leader, as we read in that story of Jonah, who's not afraid to tell the truth and to forgive, whose great and divine love gives birth to new life, and who shares his scars so that we can have the courage to share our scars and come back to new life. I wrote down a few things that they said that I wanted to remember. First of all, partiality or holding on to your own faith is not the same thing as exclusion or refusing to associate with other faiths. It's important for us to know and to love and to speak about our faith and respectfully listen to others. When we're judgmental, we put God in a box, but God is bigger than a box. Break down the binaries, the us versus them, and move toward both and. Remembering that we're family, all of us. Telling the truth from our heart opens the ears of our hearers. Listening helps us better understand our neighbor and helps our trust with each other to grow. Like Jonah, God has put you and me out there in the world to be messengers of God's truth and grace and love. This is our work. It's our labor in the fields right where we are, with people in our school, in our work, in our family, in our community. And maybe you don't think that you're qualified for this work. But let me give you a few examples. After her suicide attempt at age 17, my sister Rhonda spent most of her life with multiple handicaps, living in group homes and nursing homes. She may not be the person who comes to mind when you think about doing Christian evangelism work and spiritual care. But if it weren't for Rhonda's speaking God's truth to me, I would not be here as your pastor today. And for the residents and the staff in her nursing home, they wouldn't have had someone who prayed for them every time they came into her room, which they told me helped them to do their daily work. And a dear young friend of mine who is one of the most engaging and loving people that I know lives with Down syndrome. And she is the person who taught me to be an advocate for God's children of all ages and all abilities to be welcomed to receive Holy Communion. And now our little children are the most eager ones here to receive Jesus' sacrament. And all of our visitors and our guests know, even though it's not the case in all churches, that they are welcomed here by Jesus to celebrate communion with us. Like Jesus' parable teaches, God invites each of us to be part of the work of God's kingdom right here, right now. To do those things that God's Spirit shows us, whispers to us, is needed with the people and the creation that God gives to us to love. We are not to judge ourselves as more deserving because we work harder or we know more. In God's justice and in God's mercy, thankfully, even when we can barely check off one box of what God has required of us, we're still given God's great gifts of life, grace, eternal love. I don't think that God will ship you off in a whale, but God is hoping that you'll answer when you're called. Amen.